Oh, hello there. Is this thing on? I think it might be. So, welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. This is, of course, the Saturday stream, which is distinct from the Sunday stream in that it happens on Saturday and not Sunday. Well, now that we've got all of that bureaucracy out of the way, I want to talk about a subject that is really fun. And for some of you out there, it will be a bit of a nostalgia trip. And for others, it might be the introduction to one of the many aspects of the wide world of music. Because when you're a pilot, 90% of the time you're going to be in the cockpit of a plane. When you're a trucker, 90% of the time you're going to be in a truck. But when you're a musician, there's no one single habitat in which you will inhabit. One day you could be in a studio, the next day you could be at a bar, and I don't mean drinking necessarily at the bar, I mean performing at the bar. The next day you could be at a musician's union hall looking for work. The next day you could be touring the world with a major artist. The following day you could be playing for a birthday party of someone you've never heard of. And those are just some of the examples. But what about the great bands that played for the late night talk shows in the golden age of American television, from the 50s up until, let's say, the internet? Well, this is a very interesting tale. And like most things with early television, we really ought to begin in radio. Now, most radio stations in the world, whether the commercial stations of North America or the state owned stations of the Soviet Union in Europe, they all had in house orchestras for a very simple reason. Not that reason. But before the Germans invented magnetic tape in the 1930s, something that the world wouldn't discover until the second half of the 1940s, live sound broadcast over the radio prior to magnetic tape sounded much better than the recording on the various acetate discs and other pre-mag recordings. And because of this, the radio stations would broadcast orchestras playing live. It was better sound quality, and it was just considered par for the course, par for the course in terms of what the programming they would present. 78s, which were the most typical means of conveying recorded music, had to be turned over multiple times to play a single large piece of music. But when you were going live, there was nothing between the microphone and the airwaves other than your imagination. And if I should have been reborn, then maybe I should have been reborn as a Madison Avenue radio ad man of the 1930s, but that's as maybe. So all of these radio stations had their in-house orchestras, their in-house bands. There were musicians who worked for the stations. Sometimes they would be performing live concerts on air. Sometimes they would be providing the underscore for a radio play. Sometimes they would be doing sound effects. They would literally be doing everything. Now, by the time television became a mainstream format in the 1950s, magnetic tape was here, and it was very much here to stay. But the idea of a live orchestra that would create a sense of intimacy and interactivity and, frankly, realism with the audience on the other side of the CRT, cathode ray tube, it became a rather standard fixture in television. And ironically, this was the time that many radio stations began either downsizing or ending their orchestras. For instance, the NBC Symphony Orchestra, known for being directed by Toscanini and the very different Stokowski, it wound up, it closed in 1953, although members of the orchestra kept on going without NBC's backing, and that was called the Symphony of the Air. Bit of trivia for you now. But when it comes to bands that would back the late night talk shows, a tradition was really started in the early 50s that really, in some ways, is still going to this day. And this was that every comedian, talk show host, personality type needed a band of his own. And the first one was one that has historic reverberations right up into very recent times. And this was, of course, the Skitch Henderson band that was on the Steve Allen show. Steve Allen was one of the first, if not the first, really successful man to host this late night television format that, in a more or less intact way, continues to this day. Now, Skitch Henderson was an incredibly talented composer, arranger, pianist, and band leader. And he had worked with one of my two favorite arrangers of all time when he was younger. He worked with the great Gordon Jenkins, who, along with Don Costa, is, I think, they're two of the finest arrangers ever. And he worked with Steve Allen to develop a format where there would be intro music, outro music, between ad breaks, the band would play to sort of keep people in the studio going, while also creating sort of a natural sort of intro and outro to each segment of the show. They would sometimes participate in underscores for the various comedy bits, and they would back some of the musicians and singers that, well, not singers or musicians, that would be guests on the program. Now, Skitch talked about working with Steve Allen because Steve himself was a musician. And as Steve became more and more of a musician, as he practiced more and got more into it, Skitch talked about how Steve would often he would compose more and more of the music, and he would bring it to him, and Skitch would, change various parts of the arrangements to make them make sense because Steve, let's say, would have a bass play a note that really you can't play on a bass, that kind of bass. And so Skitch would obviously fix it. They developed what ended up being a very mutual relationship, even though in later interviews, Skitch said, yeah, Steve Allen wanted to get his composition credits on as many of these pieces as possible, which sometimes caused tension, but it all worked out. And Skitch maintains that Steve Allen was the best person he's ever worked with in that side of the industry. They ended up being very, very good acquaintances. Now, when Steve Allen left the famous Tonight Show, a man called Jack Parr came on to take his place. Now, Jack was someone who was famous for sort of intimate style interviews. He cried a lot on air. He resigned live on air and then came back. Very much an emotional roller coaster of a guy. And his band leader was a very different type. Skitch Henderson was sort of your typical big band of what we now call classic pop, traditional pop, very much informed by the jazz world, classically trained. And so that was Skitch Henderson. Now, Jose Meles was much more of a sort of jazzy Cuban samba, much more upbeat type of guy. And the Jack Parr theme, very modern for the time. Was obviously composed by Jose, and it was really a good piece of music. You should definitely take a look, listen to that. And then, of course, came the man who would not only conquer this format, but he would really become the quintessential person in this format. And this was Johnny Carson. Don't make me say here's Johnny. But he came around in the mid 1960s and he went back to Skitch Henderson. And most of the people that Skitch brought with him were people from the original Steve Allen show. And this is one thing that I think is very interesting about this subject. Once these shows sort of get their format down with each various host, they tend to lock into that format. So Steve Allen, even though he did many shows over the years, he was always locked into the era where he emerged as a new talent, the early 1950s. Same with Johnny Carson, same with Jay Leno, and we'll get to the musical significance of that shortly. So Skitch Henderson was back with Johnny Carson in, not, I said the mid 60s, it was the early 60s. But then in the mid 60s, they moved the band from New York to Southern California and the beautiful studios in downtown Burbank. And the leadership of the band changed from Skitch Henderson, who Johnny never really fully got along with. He was a tough man. And as Skitch said, Ed McMahon was really the only reason anyone on that show was able to get along with each other. He was the peacemaker. Johnny was a cold man in many ways. But the leadership of the band when Johnny moved to LA, and even slightly before, but really known for the era when it was in color and in LA, was a wonderfully talented trumpet player called Doc Severinsen. Now, all of the people's names I've mentioned so far, they are on Spotify and all of the others. So listen to Skitch Henderson, listen to Jose Miles, listen to Doc Severinsen, because all of these guys are there, and you can see just what talented musicians they truly are. Now, it was under Doc Severinsen's leadership that the band really took on a form that hit its peak. The band was bigger than ever before. It was more prominent than ever before. You had people like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin when they were guests on Johnny's show. They would sing with the band. Buddy Rich would fill in on the drums and do drum battles with the in-house drummer Ed Shaughnessy, a really, really, really good drummer who you really, if you don't know about Ed Shaughnessy, definitely check him out. And the band just became sort of legendary in their own right. Their pay increased at this time. Many of the members of the band, Shaughnessy being one of them, became increasingly household names in addition to people who were highly respected in the worlds of session music, big band, and jazz. Now, big band and jazz, those were the idioms, the musical idioms that tended to define the Tonight Show band under the period of Johnny Carson. And to be fair, under the period of Steve Allen, too. If anything, they were even more sort of jazzy and boppy in the Steve Allen era, which again, this is a reflection of the music of the time. Bebop was the latest, coolest thing in the early 1950s. And while still very much a big band, pop oriented band under Skitch at that time, Steve Allen's love of jazz definitely filtered into it. And it was also a reflection of the musical zeitgeist. When Johnny came in, it was the early 60s, and who were people listening to? Well, they were listening to Sinatra, Bobby Darin, Dean Martin, Andy Williams, Perry Como, and these great singers were generally backed by big bands. That was the pop music idiom of the time, and big band obviously very much closely aligned and influenced by the various styles of jazz that have arisen over the years. And Johnny Carson was on air for, I think, around 30 years. He was on forever, and the essence of the band remained mostly unchanged throughout his tenure, certainly from the Severinsen era in the late 60s to his final show in 1992. The big band stayed the same. And a lot of musical changes in the pop world occurred during that time. For one, big band and jazz derived pop music was replaced by pop music whose idiomatic tendencies and characteristics were really derived from the rock world. In other words, sometime between the early and the late 60s, pop went from being a genre dominated by jazz with a bit of big band and heavily arranged music to something where everyone needed an electric guitar, a rock and Hammond organ, that type of thing. Just look at the pop charts in 1961 compared to 1969. In fact, I've done that on a previous episode that you can check out. But when a show finds a format like this, they're quite conservative in terms of being locked into this format. There's even a funny segment from the 80s when the band tries to back ZZ Top, and it doesn't necessarily work. Not because the styles were clashing, but I think there was some miscommunication about the cues of when to come in. Quite a funny clip. You can see it online. They all get it together after a few bars, though, because good musicians on both sides. And the Tonight Show band, the NBC Orchestra, and of course ZZ Top. Now, let's bring things into more recent decades. So, in the 80s, NBC decided to put a new show, a new talk show on that would appeal to younger, more out there audiences. And this was David Letterman's show. And the newness and the sort of out there this of the show reflected a comedic zeitgeist, and the band reflected a musical zeitgeist. So while Johnny Carson remained firmly planted in sort of the early 60s idiom of music that would, be suitable for backing your Bing Crosby's and Frank Sinatra's, Paul Shaffer's band, Paul Shaffer being the band leader for David Letterman, they were a band well and truly of the early 80s. These were the kinds of session musicians that could, let's say, deputize for the guys in Toto, if so needed. These were sort of the kings of East Coast session music, where Toto were the kings of West Coast session music. But some of the names in the band, I mean, Paul Shaffer himself, such a great session player and keyboard player. Will Lee, one of the finest session bass players ever. Hiram Bullock was the original guitar player in the band before going on to a really successful, by jazz fusion standards, solo career. Steve Jordan, really, really talented drummer, who was then replaced by another talented drummer, Anton Fig. So many talented people came into that band, but the lineup of Lee, Schaefer, and Fig, they were sort of the ones that remained really stable throughout the years, as did Sid McGuinness on guitar. Wonderful guitar player there. Now, this band was the kind of band that could back Eddie Van Halen, and they did, back Warren Zevon, and they did, because these were session musicians who knew the world of modern pop, which was a rock and roll derived idiom by the 1980s, backwards and forwards. And again, this band was with Letterman well into the age of Taylor Swift. So it just goes to prove once these late night bands are locked in, they stay locked in, and their style and their approach to music tends to be emblematic, or we could even say symptomatic, of the era in which the show began. Carson's band in the 80s sounded like a band from the early 60s or even late 50s, derived from Steve Allen's band, whereby in the early to and mid 2000s, David Letterman's band sounded like a band of the 1980s. Now, in comes Jay Leno in 1992, and his first band leader was Bradford Marsalis. There are various stories about him not really wanting to laugh at the comedy, and because Jay didn't want an Ed McMahon, he wanted the band leader to be that. And so his tenure on the show was brief, but someone whose tenure on the show was very long was Kevin Eubanks. Now, Kevin Eubanks in the 1980s released some of the best jazz fusion guitar albums of all time. Kevin Eubanks is someone who was and remains a really high in demand player in the jazz scene. He's got immaculate technique. He's really fast across the fretboard. And he again represented a kind of jazz fusion of the late 80s and early 90s. Very clean, very virtuosic, unabashedly funky. This was the kind of stuff, think the Chick Corea Electric Band that started in the 80s, but in the jazz world, the early and mid 90s was really just an extension of the 80s. And Kevin Eubanks was with Jay Leno for a long, long time. The band didn't really change much, just as David Letterman's didn't from the early 80s and Johnny's didn't from the 60s. So let's just recap how these bands are sort of emblematic of these various eras. You have Skitch Henderson on Steve Allen, who then stays on board into the 60s with Johnny Carson. Doc Severinsen makes the band even larger. And so you have a sort of continuity of a pop idiom, big band, jazz influence from the 50s and 60s that lasts all the way up into Johnny's final show in 1992, with no attempts to change the band to reflect the new musical idioms of the various eras that came after the early 1960s. One of those days, folks. Likewise, with Dave Letterman, you have a band that locked into the style of the early 80s, or what I call an East Coast version of the Toto sound. They remained that way until Letterman's final show in the I think, do we call it the mid 2000s, the 2D teens, whatever the hell you call them, but you get the point. Jay Leno, Kevin Eubanks, his band reflected the jazz fusion of the early 1990s, which, as I said, in that world was an outgrowth of what happened in the 80s. Stayed that way till more or less the end, when he then brought in a guy, what was his name? Ricky Minor, a great bass player. I think, it's definitely Minor, having a Joe Biden moment. I'm still allowed to have this. But even that retained that funky sort of fusiony sound of the late 80s, early 90s. Consistency was important. Now, let's look at some of the other shows that have risen up since then. Conan O'Brien's show featured a big band at a time, it wasn't a huge big band, but big band in terms of its style, at a time when that was having something of a revival. This was the era when Brian Setzer was doing that type of thing, and then a lot of Brian Setzer orchestra clones popped up in the 90s. And because of Conan with the hair and with the sort of absurdity, this was all about doing a throwback, and a throwback it remained. Jimmy Kimmel's band, again, very talented musicians. They were his friends, and they had this sort of nondescript but very versatile style of session musician that would have been very in demand in the early 2000s when Jimmy Kimmel's show started, because music was shifting in the early 2000s. Hip hop was replacing rock and roll as the primary idiom of pop music. But since both managed to coexist to a degree in the very early 2000s before hip hop won the day, you needed to have versatility. And Cleto and the Cletones, Jimmy Kimmel's house band, they are emblematic of that kind of need for versatility. They've locked in and they're the same as they were in, I think, what was it, 2002, 2003, really early 2000s when that show started. Now, Jimmy Fallon did something similar to what Jay Leno did in that he took an artist that was already quite well known and said, "Let's do this and lead the band." In Fallon's case, it was a band that had quite a lot of big mainstream popularity, and this was the Roots. Now, the Roots represented the music of, frankly, this era, because the Jimmy Fallon show is relatively recent. Let's say the last 10 years, because musical trends tend to happen in decades. What are the Roots? Well, it's improvisational hip hop fusion. So it's hip hop based, but with a jazz pedigree, the discipline of session musicians, and the ability to improvise like a jazz musician, but within that framework of a hip hop beat. And again, that is very much a reflection of the era when Jimmy Fallon began his show. So, what is there a lesson? Is there a moral in this story that I've told? Well, it shows that television is, at least when it was in its golden era, it was a rather conservative medium. Not in the sense that new shows didn't come along and break boundaries, but in the sense that a style was worked on, a style was adopted, and that style was kept decades after it went out of style on the pop charts. So while the music that people like Skitch Henderson and Doc Severinsen played was very popular in the 50s and early 60s, by the time you're in 1975, young and even sort of middle age, people in their 30s, they're listening to Led Zeppelin, they're listening to the Doobie Brothers, they're listening to Helen Reddy, they're listening to the Eagles, they're not listening to big band music. But on Johnny's show, you were. Now, look at David Letterman. Were people listening to people like Hiram Bullock? Were they listening to people like Toto in the middle of the 90s? Some people were. Most people were listening to Tupac or to Pearl Jam. But on the David Letterman show, you weren't. Look at Jay Leno. Were people listening to the kind of David Sanborn, Kevin Eubanks style, a funky fusion of the late 80s, early 90s when Leno went off the air? No, when Leno went off the air, Taylor Swift and Kanye West were popular, but it was still that same style on the Jay Leno Tonight Show. Was the Brian Setzer sort of swing revival of the 90s big when Conan left? No, that revival wasn't very long lasting, except for Setzer, who maintained an audience because he's talented, but the clones didn't really make it. But Conan's band had that sort of big band parody style right up until the end. And so if you want to see what a certain style was like at a certain time, just look at when these late night shows began, because what they're doing now, whenever now is going to be what was musically in vogue the year the show started. If you can think of a show that completely changed not only its band membership, but changed the style of music the band played in the middle of the show's run, definitely tell me, because I'd be really curious. Because certainly all of the big ones I can think of, they kept a style, they stuck with the style, and in most cases, they even stuck with the personnel. Well, I feel like I should sort of tell a joke and do a song and dance because it's all about late night comedy music, but that's a wrap for today. No business like show business, especially if you're playing music on the television. But YouTube, of course, is the television of this century. So like and subscribe, and as always, we will see you next time. Take care.